The Yellow Turbans, rebels founded on spiritual beliefs, tired of being mistreated and oppressed by the corrupt nobles of the Han dynasty, they rose up to challenge the injustice. This video will just be a small showcase of some of the units in the Yellow Turbans army, as most of the warlords in the game will all share the same troops to choose from, but the Yellow Turbans get all their own units. This brings the first piece of true faction variety to Total War 3 Kingdoms. Now, let's do it. We'll begin with the 3 new hero types that are available. First of all, the Healer. He excels at inspiring troops and fighting at range, but is weaker in melee. So you're not going to want to be throwing him into other heroes to try and fight them, or into big crowds of strong enemies, because he's probably going to take a beating. But you do want to keep him nearby the bulk of your troops, because he does have Encourage, so will help their leadership and morale and keep them going that little bit longer. And then we've got the Veteran hero type, who excels at holding out against many enemies, but is susceptible to armor piercing damage. So if you need someone to hold the line for a good while, this fella has got you covered, but do be careful of those armor piercing heroes or units, or missiles. And lastly we have the Scholar. Excels at engaging enemy generals and highly skilled foes, but is easily overwhelmed. I'm not quite sure what easily overwhelmed means, other than his leadership is a little bit low, but overall he's going to be your go-to dueling guy if you need one. So those are the 3 different hero types that you could get. Now let's take a look at some actual units. First up, the People's Warband. Dual-wielding light sword infantry, a damage dealer unit overall with a decent amount of armor piercing damage. They'll want to be getting stuck into the front line, or maybe flanking around to get after some missiles. They don't have a great deal of armor though, so they do have to be wary of missiles themselves, and especially cav charges. If flanking is really what you're after though, the Venerable Wu will be who you need. Another light sword infantry that are very quick on their feet. They also have the Scare ability, so they can reduce enemy morale, and they have poison weapons, which will inflict damage over time to any units they engage with. So very useful for weakening the enemies, especially if you flank round and support your front line. They also have great melee evasion and ranged block chance, so they've got a good chance of avoiding damage, and these boys are so dangerous that their unit size is half that of a normal unit. And another dangerous half-sized unit, the Yuzha. These are a heavy sword infantry that are damn tough. They've got a lot of armor and they are unbreakable. They can function well as a frontline unit, but they do have guerrilla deployment, so they can be placed outside the usual deployment zone at the start of a battle, meaning you can try some sneaky ambushes and things, which is of course always nice. And for one of your most expensive melee units, Scholar Warriors. These are an assault style unit, so a lot of damage to output into their foes' faces. Got great melee evasion, so they can avoid damage really well, as they do have fair armor and ranged block chance as well. But these boys are also a little bit special because they will encourage their allies, so they can provide a morale bonus to nearby units. And again, they have half the maximum size of a unit. If you prefer bonking people on the head with large balls on sticks though, then Arm of the Supreme Peace may be the unit you're looking for. They actually have a quarter of the maximum unit size, only 60 on extreme unit sizes, and as you may have guessed, they are a damage dealing unit. They have splash attack, so they'll hit more than one person when they swing that big old whatever it is. So lots of damage output, a fair amount of armor piercing in there as well, fairly decent melee stats, a good bit of armor. They're going to be pretty horrible. They also have the Raider trait, which means when they're just stood around idle, they'll just start burning things. Literally. Absolute maniacs. Onto some spears, and we've got the Reclaimers, heavy spear infantry. Damn good at surviving with a lot of armor and a lot of kind of defenses. Of course they're going to be great at taking down cavalry, but they have a fair amount of armor piercing damage, so they can put the hurt into people, but overall just a fairly basic powerful spear unit. They will be able to use shield wall and box formations as well. And onto a heavy halberd infantry who are great on the front line, Guardians of the Land. They've got good armor and are good in melee in general, got a lot of reach on their weapons, so they're just going to be good at staying alive and holding that front line for as long as possible, while still being able to dish out some damage. No shield or ranged block chance though, so they might need to be wary of armor piercing missiles. And speaking of missiles, Archery Masters. These are a suppression type missile unit, meaning they have longer range and more ammo than most, at the expense of some damage. So great for keeping the pressure on units and maybe forcing them to fall back. Useful if you want to play a defensive playstyle or defend in sieges, but of course they will get stomped in melee. They also have half the maximum unit size. If you want something more fancy though, Bringers of Righteousness, medium glaive and bow infantry. As you can see, they have a formation where they'll put some halberds out front as a defense, and then the rest will be bowmen behind. So great for making them a really independent unit. They can defend against cavalry, they can defend against missiles, they can defend against melee units themselves, as they are pretty good in melee if they're just all in melee. So a really nice all-rounder unit, going to be great for many things. And another light bow infantry with a difference. Let me make sure I pronounce this one correctly though. Men of the Forest. Now these men aren't just any old archer men. They can be guerrilla deployed first of all. They're immune to fatigue, so they won't get tired. And they can cross all terrain, meaning no terrain penalties will apply to them. They can run up hills like it ain't no thing. They're also very fast on their feet, so they're going to be very difficult to catch, especially if you can find some good terrain to keep them safe on. They have a good bit of armor piercing damage as well, and potentially flaming shot. And just to a bit of cavalry, the Virtuous Noblemen, heavy axe cavalry. And they're a melee cavalry more than a shock cavalry. They've got a lot of armor, a lot of ranged block chance, good shield defenses, good armor piercing damage with that axe. So a nice assault style unit, great for dishing out the damage. They're also resistant to fatigue and are disciplined, which means they won't lose morale if their general dies. And lastly, some missile cav, horseback huntsmen. These are your typical missile cavalry, but they have guerrilla deployment, so they could try some sneaky ambushes at the start of battles, deploy up in front of the army, drop a few shots. They can have flaming shot as well, and then they can retreat as they are pretty quick, quicker than most cavalries. So great for harassing the enemy and doing that damage over time. Not very good in melee though, so keep them out of those melee fights to make the most of them. So there you go, a whole bunch of the Yellow Turbans units, and these are a lot of the mid to high tier units. I didn't show you many of the early game units, so you'll still have plenty to see when the game drops in a week or two. But it seems like the Yellow Turbans have a lot of powerful higher tier units. That's why most of them seem to be half unit sizes, only 120 in the unit rather than 240 on extreme unit sizes. Which means they're going to be very dangerous if you use them properly, but they could be pretty vulnerable with that smaller unit size. Overall, it's nice to see this variation in Total War 3 Kingdoms, as of course most of the warlords will share the same units, like some Total Wars of old, Shogun 2 namely. And the Yellow Turbans DLC is included if you pre-order the game as an early adopter bonus. So if you like the look of the Yellow Turbans and you've been thinking about pre-ordering, then now is probably the time to do it before it comes out, and then you have to pay for that DLC separately. Of course you get different campaigns, you get different campaign mechanics playing as the Yellow Turbans, and they are some of the hardest campaigns because everybody hates you because you're a rebel, basically. So they're going to be pretty tough, not for first timers, but pretty fun if you want to stand up against your oppressors and you like what the Yellow Turbans are going for. So there you go. I hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the future.